speakers, after which we'll have opening statements, and then we'll discuss a few different topics, and then we'll go to Q&A, and then we'll have closing statements as well. But thank you very, very much to all of our speakers and to all of you for coming, and I'm sure it's going to be a very, very interesting and informative event. So for the biographies, and of course I should send all of our best wishes to Dr. Farman Farmayan, who unfortunately can't join us. She has come down with something, so unfortunately has not been able to join us today. But nonetheless, I hope we'll be able to have a very interesting conversation nonetheless. So starting with Dr. Abdulaziz Sager, Saudi expert on Gulf politics and strategic issues. Dr. Sager is the founder and chairman of the Gulf Research Center, a global think tank based in Jeddah, with a well-established worldwide network of partners and offices in both the Gulf region and Europe. In addition to having authored and edited numerous publications, Dr. Sager frequently contributes as a commentator on major international media channels such as Al-Arabiya, France 24, and BBC. He's also involved in and has chaired Syrian opposition meetings in Riyadh. He holds a PhD in politics and international relations from Lancaster University, an MA from the University of Kent, and a BA from the Faculty of Economics and Public Administration from King Abdulaziz University. And Sir John Jenkins is a senior fellow at Policy Exchange in London. He was executive then corresponding director at the International Institute for Strategic Studies based in Manama, Bahrain, from January 2015 to December 2017, and a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs from January to September 2017. Until January 2015, he served as British ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was also the Benghazi-based British Special Representative to the National Transitional Council and was later ambassador to Libya during the 2011 revolution. So he's also been ambassador to Iraq, Syria, and Burma. And he's also been consul general in Jerusalem. And over the course of his 35-year career in the British diplomatic service, he's also lived and worked in Kuwait, Malaysia, and the UAE, and was director for the Middle East and North Africa in the Foreign Office in London from 2007 to 2009. He studied at Jesus College, Cambridge, like myself, SOAS, and the London Business School, and has written for the New Statement, The Guardian, The Times, The Daily Telegraph, and Arab News, and is a regular commentator on regional affairs for the BBC and others. And Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Deputy Security Advisor in Israel, and a long-term senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, teaches political science at Columbia, NYU, and Tel Aviv universities. He's the author of Zion's Dilemmas, How Israel Makes National Security Policy, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Global Change, and Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. He's published numerous academic articles and over 150 op-eds, and appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. So I will now pass to our speakers. I think we'll go in alphabetical order. So Dr. Sager, if you'd like to start with opening statements, maybe between 5 and 10 minutes, just giving your perspective on the topic that we decided to base this talk on, which is change and continuity in Middle East geopolitics. So what has changed and what has stayed the same in the region? So if Dr. Sager, you'd like to start.
Very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends which part of the world you are. It's my great pleasure. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm glad to be with some familiar faces and friend, Ambassador JJ, as we call him. He's famous in our part of the world with this special initial, JJ. So, and also some other friends here I have with us, I can see in the screen. I think if I go through the current geopolitical situation in the region, I would need 5 days minimum to summarize it. But going over it quickly, I think I'll start with the situation in Yemen. In Yemen, of course, we have not seen a definite political solution, neither a military decisive solution. So still it's in between. The political coalition is still there. The military coalition is not there anymore. There is 3 different sort of struggles, I would call them, or conflict here. One within the legitimate government between Hadi government and its own people, whether they are the Southern Council or they are the other party. And then there is the legitimate government with the Houthi, that sort of conflict. And then the coalition facing difficulties with the different Yemeni party, being it the Houthi, the legitimate government, the Southern Council, all other parties. So it's a multiple dimension conflict here and not just a single one. I mean, people sometimes they try to simplify it and say coalition against the Houthi. It's not. It's much more complicated, and with less international definitive role that being played. Iran have continuously been involved since 5 years. We have received more than 300 or close to 300 ballistic missiles. We have received many drones, Katyusha in 100,000, you can call it. But at the same time, the Houthi is able to survive because he's still keeping Sana'a in their hand, and he still get a lot of sympathy, acknowledgement, whatever you want to call it, from the different international, parties. However, is the Saudi really willing to accept, to go through as a sort of political negotiation? They've always said yes, but at the same time, I think today we have a very difficult example. I hope nobody will follow that example, which is the U.S. government negotiating with Taliban and not with the Afghani government. So they are setting a very bad example that a country like U.S. negotiating directly with a violent non-state actor like Taliban. And this is where the Houthi trying today to follow that example. The Houthi today, they want Saudi Arabia to accept to negotiate directly with them and not any other party. I'll move quickly to Iran. I think we still have a very difficult situation with Iran. When Iran attacked Saudi Arabia in September, a deliberate attack and a surprising attack on the oil critical facility, Saudi decided not to respond to such things. In fact, we took it ease. We did not respond to such an attack, but at the same time, we tried to make the international community responsible and to go through a very detailed investigation. Finally, last week, we've heard the UN saying those missiles, they were manufactured in Iran and they are an Iranian product without blaming Iran directly and without identifying where they came from. And I think, some people can say we understand why not to define that, but at the same time, it shows, the difference between reality and hiding part of it or declaring part of it and so on. But at the same time, we remain very strong in support of the U.S. policy toward Iran, which is the of the clear agenda that we think that we need to find a proper answer for it. The missiles program, the JCPOA, the nuclear program, also the interventionist policy, the expansionist policy by using the sectarian dimension, the maritime security, the oil critical also facility, security. So those issues, plus of course supporting terrorism and supporting a violent non-state actors like Al-Hashd al-Sha'b in Iraq, Hezbollah in Iran, the militia in Syria, everywhere, with that sort of intervention. So we remain quite clear in our position there. Our worries, of course, is what sort of position we're going to have if President Trump will be re-elected. Is he going to keep status quo? Is he going to increase the pressure, or is he going to renegotiate with them? We understand if Biden come into power that he's going to ease up a lot and he's going to be very soft when it, reinstall the JCPOA agreement and deal with it differently. So in reality, what is going to happen in Washington will have a major impact on our relation in the region, whether being it a Gulf relation or Gulf-Iran relation, or the whole political, the whole security architecture of the region. Very quickly, I'll go into Iraq, and I see Iraq, of course, the new prime minister is very much welcome. We agree with all his agenda in fighting corruption and reducing the role of the violent non-state actor, or Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, or all the militias, and at the same time, containing Iran role to some extent. I think, they're all, very much welcome as a new policy. He still enjoy a good relation to every party, but we don't know how far he will be able to survive, to continue to be able, with such a policy. The pressure is going to be quite a lot on his side. Syria, yes, you mentioned I was the moderator for 2015, the Syrian opposition, and 2017 also in Saudi Arabia. But again, today the situation, we have a two definitive role. The US is combating the Russian role in Syria. I think we all realize with the 3 plane came on the beginning in Syria, ended by having two strong bases. One is Navy, and the other one is an air base, Hamim and Tartus, with 30 years agreement with the Syrian government. We have never anticipated or thought, that will go that far. But again, the Israeli, they're doing, containing the Iran role there, which is very important. Otherwise, Iran will just have an endless expansion in their activity in Syria. So it's no longer an Arab decision. It's no longer a regional issue that we are tackling with that one. It's more of a US-Russia, but also with other three, of course, major involvement: Turkey, Israel, and Iran. At the same time, I think we fully support the process of going back to Geneva 1 and Geneva 2. I think on the Geneva 1, it's a very important process, and it should have been adopted and pushed since long time. We're no longer demanding the change of the regime. Or throwing the regime out. We are demanding the change of the attitude of the regime, because that's a very important one. Libya, very quickly, if I still have more minutes to go, or?
I think we can handle Libya too.
Okay, let's handle Libya also. Libya, it's a very, no way Turkey would have done their intervention in Libya without a US not minding it. Because again, the US, they don't want to see that the Russian role again in Libya, as Haftar have promised to give the Jafra base to the Russian. Nobody wanted to see another Russian expansion role in the region. But I think nobody also wished to see a stronger, Turkish role. I think we're very concerned today about Iran and Turkey role in the region and their expansionist. So we do not wish to see that one. But at the same time, we understand that Turkey to go that far, of course, is very important. We support Egypt in their own national security dimension, but we know Egypt, they're going to be very busy with the Sadd al-Nahda, the Nahda Dam, and they're going to be busy also in Sinai and also now with Libya. But at the same time, this is overstretching for Egypt. I'm not so sure if they can handle all the three at the one time. On the Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, I think we remain very balanced in terms of our relation. We understand it's a technical and legal issue. We do not wish to see a conflict between them, but at the same time, we remain in support of either a direct negotiation or a Security Council resolution or a mediation that can resolve that issue. We are not happy with all the continuation there, but anyhow, just a last word on the Corona and the post-Corona Gulf. I think it's more of an economic impact and not a political, because maybe in some democratic system, they will be blamed for not taking a major political decision or so. In our part, I think it's more of an economic and how to deal post-Corona. It has to do with the oil prices. It has to do with the stimulus packages. And then we have a foreigner labor that some of them will leave, that this will have an impact. We have a local, national labor that they want to secure their job, and I don't think there's a problem with that one. So it's more of an economic impact rather than a political impact, because there's no question about regime or changing or so, and the government are trying to do whatever in their capacity when it comes to that one. If you want me to stop here, I'll stop here. If you want me to add the Israeli issue, I'll do that one. But then anyhow, it's up to you.
I think we'll save that for the discussion.
Okay, for the negotiation. That's fine. For the discussion.
So, Dr. Freilich, you'd like to be next in alphabetical order.
Okay, thank you. First of all, it's good to be with you. Thank you for hosting it, and shukran and toda rabah to my colleagues for participating in the panel. I think actually Dr. Sager's last remarks were a good starting point for me, because I'm actually quite concerned about the implications of the ongoing crisis in the region, greatly added to now by the corona and oil crises, to regime stability. Now, maybe the problems will just be limited to economic and social ones, but we have to also take into account the possibility that it may be beyond that. I have long believed that the so-called Arab Spring of 2010 is something that is going to be with us for decades, because all of the root causes of the Arab Spring at the time are all still there today, even more so. Vast unemployment and lack of economic opportunity, combined with a population explosion along the region, the lack of political freedoms. So regardless of everything else, this was going to be with us for decades. Now add to it Corona, add to it the drop in oil income, and I think we're in a severe situation, and we have seen economic contraction, severe economic contraction in a number of states, even before the Corona crisis, or certainly now. As a matter of fact, I think if you look, pretty much all of the states in the region are already in a state of crisis or maybe heading to it. Syria and Iraq were devastated by their civil wars. They're barely holding it together. Libya and Yemen also devastated by their civil wars, not quite holding it together. Lebanon has defaulted on its debts in an unprecedented economic crisis. Egypt is stable now, but totally preoccupied, I think, by its domestic travails. Saudi Arabia has been dealing with the combination of crises, oil, pilgrimage. I've long felt that the Crown Prince may have too many balls in the air. He seems to be trying to change things pretty much across the board in Saudi Arabia. Economic diversification, the 2030 vision, social change, women's rights, cinemas, political change, significant changes in Saudi foreign and defense policy, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's the quiet relationship that is reportedly developed with Israel, and his public statement, I believe a dramatic statement recognizing Israel's right to exist, and maybe also beginning to look for some alternatives to complete reliance on the US. Can the Crown Prince pull it off? Will the succession be stable? I don't think it's a done deal yet. I hope so, at least in terms of stability. Iran has seen the worst demonstrations since the revolution last year, protests, ongoing protests in Iraq and Lebanon. They totally mishandled the Corona crisis with vast numbers of dead, and that already contributed to the growing crisis, or maybe that's a strong word, but certainly lack of confidence in the regime. The ongoing confrontation with the US over the nuclear issue. And this is a confrontation where I think both sides are rapidly using up the diplomatic cards that they have to play. We already saw an exchange of military blows in the last year, and they don't have too many more diplomatic moves to make. The crunch may come in October around the American demand for the extension of the sanctions on conventional weapon sales to Iran. I think the regime is trying desperately to play for time in the hope that Mr. Biden will be elected, and maybe that opens up new diplomatic options for them. I was and remain a strong supporter of the JCPOA, not because I thought it was the best possible option, but it was the best of the bad ones available. I think it pretty much still is, but it would be a mistake just to go back to that agreement and squander the leverage that has been achieved. We can talk about that afterwards in the Q&A. Turkey had not going so well lately. The invasion in Syria is ground to a halt. I think they're beginning to rethink the pivot towards Russia, even asked for NATO backing in Syria. Also hard hit by Corona. And last but not least, Israel is in the midst of a severe ongoing political judicial crisis, not resolved by the establishment of the so-called Coalition of National Unity. We're in the midst of a severe economic crisis and what may turn out to be a significant self-inflicted crisis over the annexation issue. Again, we'll come back to that. I don't think that there was any real possibility for progress towards peace in the region in any event. I don't think the Palestinians for many years, I don't think they've been willing to make the hard decisions that they have to make. I think Israel's increasingly unwilling to do it. And there's no doubt that this move, the annexation, if it happens, we have to see what happens. It's not clear yet. That will make things even harder. It isn't clear to me, as a closing thought, do the crises, especially the corona and economic crisis, the oil crisis is part of that, does this produce a tendency towards greater moderation on the part of the different players? Or just the opposite? Do they lash out? Do they just try to divert attention externally? And that can be the Iranians, it can be Hezbollah, it can be Hamas. There is certainly a potential for a considerable rise in regional violence over the next few months.
Thank you. And now to Sir John. That was the last.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I mean, I'll try and add something else to what's already been said by Dr. Freilich and Dr. Abdulaziz. They've covered a lot of the ground. The Middle East is a mess, quite honestly, but it's a mess in a different way and a more interesting way to the way it was before 2011, I think. And Iraq is interesting as a sort of bellwether for all of this. If you look at the demonstrations from last October, they were different to any demonstration we've seen before in Iraq. They were much younger. A lot of the demonstrators on the streets were teenagers. It was in the south. They were Shia. They were deliberately decentered. They were not people who were known to demonstrators who'd led the demonstrations even the year before. So these were new. These actually, the people who came out in the streets down in the south, in Basra, in Nasiriyah, even in Najaf and Karbala, were actually a decade before would have been with Sadr, with Muqtada al-Sadr. This time they were against Muqtada al-Sadr because they were against everybody. In the same way as in Lebanon, the demonstrators chanted Kullun Yani Kullun. It was exactly the same in Iraq. And actually it was the same in Algeria as well. I mean, if you look at the demonstrations across the region, there were commonalities to all this sort of stuff. And what do they want? I mean, it was always a debate at the time, at the end of last year, what these demonstrators wanted. And it was difficult to say because they themselves refused to be drawn. And I mean, there wasn't a leadership in the sense that there'd been a leadership before. Some of that was a deliberate choice because every time you had a leadership, the leadership had either been co-opted or destroyed. And once you did that, you decapitated the opposition, and everything went back to an unsteady state. But this hasn't changed in Iraq, and it was their persistence on the streets in the face of often quite brutal repression, similar to the repression that demonstrators had faced since the late 90s in Iran, that led to the fall of the Adil Mahdi government. And Adil was a pure product of the Mahasisa system, a consociationalism that had been imposed on Iraq as a result of the US-led imperium after 2003. And that system was poisonous. It led to Maliki, and it led in the end to Adil Abdul Mahdi. He went. Two of the main Shia groupings then tried to impose their own prime ministers, which failed. And now we have Al-Qasimi. And I agree with Dr. Abdulaziz. I think Al-Qasimi is probably the best prime minister we're going to get in Iraq for the foreseeable future. If you look at what he did recently, last week, with the raid on the Kataib Hezbollah cell, who were launching rockets into the Green Zone and elsewhere, actually attacking US bases. This is the first time any prime minister has authorized the counterterrorism service to go and do something like this. How much this is how much it was a genuine effort to arrest them and bring them to justice, and how much it was a show of resolve in the context of the US-Iraq strategic dialogue is an interesting question. But no other prime minister has done anything like this. It's at least certainly not since Ayad Alawi in the days of the first government imposed by the CPA. And that's interesting because I think he recognizes, as Barham Saleh recognizes, that you need a new dispensation in Iraq. And this dispensation has to take account of what the demonstrators want. And as Chuck Freilich has said, a lot of what they want are to do with employment, they're to do with jobs, standards of living, basic services, all the things that actually also fueled a lot of the original unrest at the time of the Arab Spring. That stuff hasn't gone away. The response of governments to the Arab Spring was to try and co-opt or suppress what had happened. The response of some movements, particularly Islamist movements, political Islamist movements, the Brotherhood and so forth, tried to hijack the revolutions. And we may look back at 2011 to 2013 as the high point of political Islamism in the region, in the same way as we look back to the late 60s, early 70s as the high point of Nasserism, and the 1950s perhaps as the high point of militarism. None of these movements or ideologies have actually satisfactorily answered the question of the Middle East state. What is it? How is it legitimate? How does it deliver to its citizens the sort of things that the citizens want, and therefore gives it its own enduring stability? And that's why the Middle East state is fundamentally so fragile, because quite too often you have a government which is in not just in opposition to its own people, but predates on its own people. You see this in Lebanon. One of the reasons that Lebanon defaulted is because the banking system is in a state of collapse. The banking system in Lebanon historically has been a gigantic Ponzi scheme designed to benefit the kleptocratic rich elite of Lebanon, Shia, Sunni, and Christian. And that's run out of steam. In Iraq, the response of the government after 2003 to unrest was often to co-opt people by giving them jobs. So in 2003, there were maybe 1 million people on the public payroll. There's now 5 million. And we see this elsewhere. But fundamentally, if you don't have the cash, you can't do this anymore. You need a new way of doing things. Now, will we get to this new way? And I think, interestingly, I think what's happened in Saudi Arabia with Mohammed bin Salman, you don't have to agree with everything he's done, but Mohammed and Saudi Arabia is not just one person, it's a country. But he and Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE actually have both identified, and I think Mohammed bin Zayed did this earlier, the need for a government which is responsive in a proper form to its citizens, in a way the governments in the Middle East historically have not been responsive to their citizens. Which is interesting, because that, you need a model of some sort for any of this to work. Even if that works, you're still left with a problem of a collapsed Syria, an Iraq which basically spends all its oil revenues on current costs, a Libya which has fallen apart, and a Lebanon which is bankrupt. And Egypt, quite frankly, which has been restabilized. I think Sisi has done in some ways quite a good job, but remilitarizing Egypt isn't going to answer the fundamental questions of employment and services in Egypt. I think, as Dr. Freilich said, we're going to be with this for a very long time. The question of a policy, there were two other questions that arise in policy terms. I'll just finish with this. One is, how much does this matter to us in the West? In Europe, in the United States, and so forth. Now, I spent most of my career in the Middle East, so I think it matters a lot. And I think it certainly matters a lot to Europe. If you think about the migration crisis following the Arab Spring, the migration crisis was something that triggered popular unrest and the rise of populist parties throughout Europe. It actually triggered Brexit. The most significant factor in those who voted for Brexit in terms of what they wanted changing was immigration. And that can happen again. That's disastrous. This is our near abroad. Does it matter to the United States? It should do, I think, although you'll find different views on this. I mean, even in the Biden team, I think. And that's an interesting debate to have. But even if you assume it only matters to Europe, Europe can't do anything about this without working with key regional powers, the key regional powers that are still standing, and Saudi Arabia is one of them, the Emirates is another. Egypt, to a large extent, is still another, although it's problematic. And it can't do it without the United States. And I think the big hole at the heart of all of this policy in the Middle East, Western policy in the Middle East, and it's one of the reasons why the Turks behave in the way they do, and the Iranians are allowed to colonize neighboring states, is the absence of the United States in an effective convening and policy forming and pushing role. And that's a big problem for all of us.
Very much. I mean, we still have an awful lot to talk about. And you know, it's hard to figure out where to start. But if we go from right to left, and we perhaps start with Gulf, and then work our way westwards, maybe ending in Libya. I think an interesting discussion to start with, and I think this is of interest to everyone on the panel, is the impact that the current crisis has had on Iranian influence in the region. Obviously, Iran's economy was already devastated by the impact of US sanctions. And you know, there was a wave of popular discontent that started in November, which to a large extent informed the decision of the Iranian government to you know, not have a lockdown at the expense of thousands of lives. In terms of how what has happened has actually had an impact on Iran's influence in Iraq, in Syria most prominently, and elsewhere in the region, how do you see the impact of the crisis, both economic and in terms of COVID-19, on Iran in the region? If anyone would like to start.
Aziz?
Yes. I think Iran is facing difficulties now in a different front. I mean, if we look at Hezbollah situation today in Lebanon, Lebanon is almost at the verge of a bankruptcy. I mean, the currency have lost a lot of its value. People are hungering, shouting in the street. Extremely difficult situation there. At the same time, in Syria, they don't declare it. They don't say how badly have been beaten by the Israeli Air Force and by the Israeli attack on their things. But at the same time, they've chosen not to show that side. But we all know it from time to time. There are some very accurate information that, so they're not doing extremely well in the Syrian front at the same time, because it's, as I said before, it's becoming a Russia-US decision there. US wanted to contain the Russian expansion of their presence in the Middle East, so we have to work all together. And again, that's another situation. Even in Libya, by the way, most of the players, with the exception of the Russian, they're all US alliances. I mean, if you look at Turkey, Qatar, UAE, Egypt, most of them, they are US alliances, with the exception of the Russian there. At the same time, also, if you look at Iraq, although the US have reduced their military bases to 2 major bases, but still that will have adequate weapon system to defend the US presence, which is more than 5,000 soldiers. Yes, the US is keeping quiet on the Turkish situation in the north of Iraq and Kurdistan and north of Syria, because they think it's a legitimate issue related to the PKK. It was always there even during Saddam time, and so they're keeping quiet on that one. So I don't think Iran is doing great with the economic situation. They have great difficulties. They try to reach to the Gulf countries. Their Minister of Health have called Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, UAE, but not Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. We did not take the call from that one. UAE tried to send some humanitarian, support, to Iran. There is no trust on the Iranian initiative of regional security architecture, when in September 2019, Rouhani came up with the 2 pillars of his Hormuz initiative, non-interventionist and non-aggression. We still believe, how about the history, the past? How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with all the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, with the Hezbollah, the Syrian militia, the Houthi? They don't want to talk about that. They want to start from zero today and forget about the past, keep those there, exist and operate the way how they want. So his initiative did not find any response from in the region, or positive response in the region. And to tell you the truth, we are a bit confused with the American position. We didn't know where the American position is going to go to. I mean, unless we have a clarity on that. So far, the maximum pressure, maybe some of the US politicians, they feel it did brought some result. We have not seen that result when they attack the gauge, the oil facility. There was no response really to that sort of attack there. So I don't think Iran has the capability to expand today, more aggressively in some of other. They're having a lot of domestic fight, but at the same time, I wouldn't take them for granted that they will not do anything, because so far they have a 4-tested case where there was no response. They pushed it to the edge in the drone, in the 4 vessels, in the 2 tankers, and on the oil critical facility. Why not? They will do another thing, and then they will see no response. Particularly if they, analyze the U.S. withdrawal of the 2 Patriot, unit from Saudi Arabia as a sign of, we're not very heavily involved there.
Can I jump in, Jay? Because
please, I'd love to.
It's the Iranians haven't stopped doing what they were doing before, and there's been a bit of talk about them withdrawing in Syria. What they've done, it seems to me, and actually Dr. Freilich will know more about this than I do. They've regrouped. They've reconfigured the pattern of their positions on the ground. But in terms of what they're doing exactly the same as they were before. They're still seeking, and a lot of this is to do. I mean, you have to look at what they do across the board. So the supply of ballistic missiles to the Houthis, for example, which the UN has documented over the last 5 years, is analogous to their supply of ballistic missiles since the 1980s to Hezbollah. And the thing that they focus on now is guidance systems, because they want to have more accurate missiles so they can attack Israel. Now, I've never understood why people say, and I hear this from lots of people, the Iranians don't mean what they say, so they don't really want to destroy Israel. Why would you think that? They've been saying this since 1979. They've been trying to find ways of attacking Israel and encircling Israel, and they've to a certain extent succeeded because of the disasters in Syria. Why would they not want to do what they have said consistently for the last 40 years that they want to do? It's madness. And actually, if you look at the way they behave with the Houthis, they look at the way that they behave with the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, and with Hezbollah, the motherboard, it's the same pattern. What they're also doing, I think they are suffering, by the way. I mean, I think the disaster of COVID-19 is a disaster. And anybody who believes Iranian figures on deaths needs their heads checking. If you look at the rate, the real to the dollar, it's collapsed. If you look at oil exports, oil revenue, it's collapsed. I mean, they are exporting less than half 500,000 barrels a day. At the peak, they were exporting, I don't know, 200,000, 2 million. Plus, oil prices have come down themselves. I think they are hurting. But their response to this is to double down on what they were doing before, which was making Iraq in particular a slave economy of Iran. If you look at the last 6 months, the number of visits from Tehran to Baghdad, most of them, apart from Ghani from time to time, has been focused on this, on the financial aspects of this. The last visit I know was, I think, last week. It was the central bank governor from Iran who went to see Ali Al-Arabiya at the central bank of Iraq, who was Maliki's guy. And what they seem to want to agree is rapid settlement of existing debt, which is huge, and an agreement by the Iraqis to allow them to use Iraqi companies to import essential products, which of course they were doing already in an underhand way. They're also doing this, I should add, in South America. Look at what they're doing with Venezuela. This whole thing about oil export, humanitarian oil export and the rest of it to Venezuela. This has been going on. This trade, this illegal trade in all sorts of different things, has been going on for 25 to 30 years. It is astonishing how they have managed to construct this alternative black economy for themselves around the world. That's one of their great sources of resilience. And do I think Khamenei is going to stop doing what he's doing? I mean, Khamenei believes all this stuff that he says. I mean, I have no doubt that Khamenei believes that he is in the service of Sahib al-Zameen, al-Amir al-Mustatar. I'm a Catholic myself. I have my own different beliefs about this sort of thing. But anyway, I think he believes this. There's nothing to, even though my guess is a majority of Iranians don't want this lot in charge, this regime will do anything to stay in power because they think they're doing God's work. And I think this is a really dangerous situation. And you can't, I mean, I agree with Dr. Freilich, and the JCPOA was not a great deal, but it was probably the best available because it bought us time, 15 years, to do something about the other stuff that Iran was doing. The problem with the JCPOA was, having done it, we all then just stepped back and did nothing. We should have had a plan, and we didn't, and we still need a plan.
Yes.
Maybe I'll pick up from the last point. There's either going to be a diplomatic move in the not too distant future, maybe still if Mr. Trump is president, or it may get deferred if Mr. Biden is elected. But as I said before, I think the two sides have largely used up their diplomatic playing cards, so to speak. And if we can't break out to a diplomatic resolution, then military action may be the last resort, and it certainly comes back into play again. And the question is, how do you reach the so-called new and better deal? Now, Iran is not going to simply accept a one-sided dictate. They're not going to fold. They are deeply committed to their nuclear program. They have withstood decades of international opposition, and in more recent years, the last decade, heavy international pressure. And by the way, Iran has got very good strategic reasons of its own to wanting a nuclear capability, and the regime also has deep political reasons for wanting it. So they're not giving it up so quickly. And to reach a new and better deal from an American, maybe a Saudi, an Israeli perspective, it's interesting that I think our perspectives here are similar. It's going to have to in some way be better for Iran also. How do you square the circle? How do you find an agreement that is better for all sides? Very, very hard to do. That's going to require extraordinarily deft diplomacy. I'm not sure that the Trump administration does that kind of diplomacy. We'll see if Mr. Biden is elected, what happens then. To squander the pressure that has been, the leverage that has been achieved, and just go back to JCPOA, I think would be a major mistake, and not one that I think Mr. Biden would be inclined to do, although there is certainly support for that in the Democratic Party. I think it's important to stress, I'm not sure that all of us fully appreciate the depth and the complexity of politics in Iran. Not a democratic country by any means, has elements of democracy. But the political process in Iran is extraordinarily difficult. And they, by the way, they have presidential elections next June. The politics makes it hard at all times, especially as they're heading towards elections, for the regime to compromise. And at least in a number of important areas, they bungled the corona crisis. They've bungled the economic crisis, the ongoing economic crisis. Their handling of the nuclear issue is problematic. So far, I think they've handled it effectively from their point of view, but they're running out of time. So how do they handle that? The American policy of maximum pressure, I'm all for pressure, but it's got to be part of a broader strategy, not just pressure. I don't think we've seen that. A comprehensive, coherent policy. In any event, the policy has been very effective in causing Iran economic pain. That wasn't the objective. It wasn't to cause pain. It was to get Iran to change its policies in 2 or 3 critical issues, first and foremost, the nuclear. That hasn't happened. We've seen them dig their heels in even deeper. Not for the first time that we've seen this pattern of behavior. Maybe, I'm not sure based on the available evidence that they've slightly cut support for Hezbollah. the figures that I've seen are something like $800 million a year. That's exactly the same figure I remember from 20 years ago. And in Syria, they continue to build up the military presence despite repeated Israeli efforts, not just attacks to prevent this. I think in and of themselves, very effective attacks, but as long as Iran is determined to set up a military presence in Syria and willing to pay a price for that, well, it can be delayed, it can be reduced. I don't know that it can be prevented. They are certainly jockeying for position. They would like to be the primary player in Syria today, not the Russians. I think the Syrians know very, very well that they need Iran because Iran is really there for the long haul, truly committed. Russia is there for the long haul also because of the military presence. But whether Assad is there or not, for Russia, Syria is a more transactional issue, whereas for Iran, it is a deep long-term commitment. They want the front, another front in addition to Lebanon for the battle against Israel. And here they've got the direct arc, an overland arc. And I was very pleased to hear Sir Jenkins' statement. I don't often hear it quite so clearly stated, is that yes, we should take Iran very seriously when they say what they say about Israel. I can tell you I sleep quite well living in Israel. I'm not concerned that they can or will be able to destroy us, even if, God forbid, they succeed in going nuclear. But I take the threat very seriously. I think they are dead serious about it. And Iran must be prevented from going nuclear.
If I may just add a very little point to the nuclear issue. We have, we were not involved in the discussion. We were happy to see a lot of the Israeli comment on the discussion at that time during the President Obama. We were concerned about the period of time because 10 to 15 years is nothing. The regime have been existing since 1979 and 10 to 15 years is nothing in terms of time. The enrichment issue, the missile program was not. The only thing that President Obama came out with as a legacy is the JCPOA. At the same time, we always felt it was not a good deal. This is why the minute that President Trump decided to withdraw from that JCPOA, we were fully endorsing that. At the same time, by the way, today we have here Ambassador Hook, who's touring the region between the special envoy to Iran with the State Department. We are very concerned about the October sanction resolution. If that passes and then we have the Russian or the Chinese today veto that decision, is going to be difficult because this will allow Iran to possess the different weapon system they always wanted and needed, for themselves to be able to use it against their neighborhood. So we fully endorse that the U.S. new resolution to prevent Iran from being able to get any military supply, and it should not be only tied to a certain period of time like the current resolution. We want it to be open until a new resolution will be established, and that's have happened before with Iraq. So why not now with Iran if they do still represent a threat to the neighborhood in the region?
Okay, so while we're still in the Gulf, I think an interesting question is the matter of Gulf unity. Obviously, the Qatar crisis has been ongoing for some years now. Just as a question, has the changing situation in the region in relation to Corona and the economic difficulties, Iran, but also increasingly Turkey, has that caused any change or shift in GCC policy towards Qatar and towards the reunification, so to speak, of the Gulf?
Well, there is two Gulf going to be in the region, a fragmented Gulf or unified Gulf. In many of the strategic issues, there is still a consensus, I would say, in principle. But for instance, when the US put a pressure on Qatar, why do you transfer money to Iran? The Qatari will come and say, because of the aerospace, we have to pay for the right of using the Iranian airspace. This is, we have to pay $150 million a year, to that one. But I'm still hoping, deep down in me, because I'm a firm believer in a Gulf unity, that it is very important and is the best for the region. I'm still deep down hoping that the Qatari will come into their sense, by having a unified Gulf is a far more stronger situation than a fragmented Gulf. And again, we're going to see a US impact on that also. It depends how things change post-November. At the same time, there's nobody withdrawing from their own borderline. Still, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE remains, flexible in some of the terms, but at the same time, there are key issues. They will not change position in that. We can't accept a full member supporting a group that we believe they do represent a threat, a serious security threat to the region. We can't expect, a full member to launch all their media capacity in support of Islamist group that do represent a threat to the region here in that way. So I think if Qatar is willing to compromise in those issues, they will find a very positive response. And I'm sure, maybe post-election, the USP will see a different situation than today.
Can I jump in? Because the GCC thing, it's always, at the time, of course, there were two Riyadh agreements. There was one in 2014, one in 2015 with Qatar, and Qatar broke both of them. And then, of course, everybody said the GCC has fallen apart. This is a disaster, they said. I never understood that. The GCC itself, which was, of course, founded in response to the Iranian Revolution and the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War, was never an effective alliance. It was an expression of some sort of political unity of purpose. But that unity of purpose actually went, I think, in many ways, a long time ago. And if you look at what happened during the Arab Spring, the Qataris in particular behaved, in my view, extremely badly. They were supporting, I was in Libya in 2011, when the Qataris were pumping money into the Islamist, largely Muslim Brotherhood-dominated militias in Benghazi, but also into the remnants of the Libyan Islamic fighting group in the West. And they were doing this in despite of the, whatever you think about the National Transitional Council, it became a recognized international government. But they were doing it, they didn't care what anybody thought. They were flying, there were 2 military flights a week into Benghazi with cash and weapons, which was all going to the Islamist group. Now the Qataris said at the time, we're doing this because we support democracy. Excuse me, that's just a horse laugh. This is a thing that poisoned the well in Libya. It was Qatari intervention. The Turks came later, but it was Qatari originally. But this goes back a long, long way. there's all sorts of reasons why this has happened. But if I'm sitting in Abu Dhabi, and if I'm one of the Beni Fatim, if I'm Mohammed bin Zayed or Abdullah bin Zayed or Hanum bin Zayed, and I have to sit through the sort of stuff that Qaradawi used to come out with on his TV program about me, about the Beni Fatim, essentially saying that we're not proper Muslims. This is fighting talk. And I don't, do I think the Emiratis had a case? You bet I think they had a case. Now you've got the Emirates, Saudi, and Bahrain together, which essentially was always that was always the case. If the Qataris want to come back, as Dr. Abdulaziz said, fine. But if they don't, so what? It's not as if Qatari interests in Gulf security are different, fundamentally different from those of the other GCC states. They're not. They're the same. And so the Qataris will say, well, we have an alternative in Iran. What alternative do you have in Iran? This is for the birds, quite honestly. So I think people over-dramatized the whole sort of GCC split, because ultimately, who cares? This is just a recognition of new political lines of force which have been there, except nobody's recognized them for decades. But if they want to come back into line, fine. But it's in their interests to do so, I think. I don't see this whole thing about everybody's going to go running to Doha, they bring it back in. I don't get it.
So I think an interesting way to kind of move slightly westward would be to consider the regional impact of Israel's annexation. Obviously, there's the Gulf perspective on that, but if we could just ask Dr. Freilich about his thoughts on the source of the decision to annex, where it came from, why now, and we can go from there.
Well, first of all, let me start off by expressing my dismay and amazement that we are 2 days from the supposed target date. It's not a deadline, but it's a target date for at least the beginning of annexation. And to the best of my knowledge, no one in the state of Israel, including the prime minister, knows what we're talking about, what annexation we're talking about. Is it the entire West Bank? Well, apparently not. Is it the 30% that the Trump plan provides for? Apparently not. Is it the Jordan Valley and the so-called settlement blocks? Maybe. Is it just the blocks? Maybe. Is it an entirely symbolic move that the prime minister may have to do just for political cover to say that he did something? All of this we do not know 2 days before. If you ask me why this, so as someone who is, I was involved in Israeli decision-making, I wrote a book about Israeli national security decision-making, shall we say that I am appalled. If you ask me what motivated this, it was a cross between two things, is that some people believe that the timing was opportune. Some people on the right in Israel believe that the timing was opportune while President Trump is certainly still in office for the next few months. Finally, an American administration after 50 years that has essentially adopted the right-wing Israeli narrative here. And so they wanted to take advantage of that. And then maybe add to the fact the feeling that the international community, the Arab world, Iran, they're all preoccupied by Iran, by the corona, the economic crisis. So certainly not as capable of responding effectively. That's one source of the decision. Another source is that I think this was driven largely by domestic politics, both in the US and in Israel. President Trump believed, at least for a while, that this would help him, at least with his evangelical voter base. I think he is less convinced of that of late, and so we've seen a cooling on the part of the administration, partly because of that, partly because they've gained a greater understanding of the regional ramifications. And for Prime Minister Netanyahu, this was part of his ongoing battle to, well, really to deflect attention from his legal troubles, because he is in serious jeopardy of going to jail in another year or so, and understandably does not want to do that. He managed to dismantle his political opposition. He has an unchallenged control of the Knesset today and for the foreseeable future. Really a remarkable political, I don't even know what to call it. I've never seen a Democratic leader take apart his opposition so effectively. And so I don't think he needs it so much politically per se, but he still needs it as part of the judicial battle. He's trying to undermine the rule of law in Israel so that he can stay out of jail, and that leads back to the political battle. That's where it comes from today. In terms of the ramifications for the region, well, first, we don't know what we're talking about yet. If it's a limited move, obviously the ramifications will be at least more moderate, and it depends what happens. I think what we can expect almost, even for a limited, even for a symbolic move, this has become so charged, there is a danger that we will see a significant rise in terrorism in the West Bank. Hamas has already said that it's going to respond. If there is a real significant rise in terrorism, then the IDF is going to have to go in to address it. And that can lead then to a further deterioration in the situation, a further escalation, and we can very shortly find ourselves in a serious Israeli-Palestinian confrontation. If that happens, Iran and primarily Hezbollah have a hard time staying out. Not that they want to get involved now. I think they've got their own troubles and do not want to, but if there's a confrontation both with the Palestinians and the West Bank and Hamas, it's hard for them to stay out. So Israel could find itself in a multi-front war or at least confrontation in short order. And then there are the diplomatic ramifications, or security ramifications for our relations with Jordan and Egypt, which has been very good in recent years. The budding relationship with Saudi Arabia, UAE, other Gulf states. At a minimum setback, maybe the joint Iranian interest doesn't lead to a complete downturn in relations, but certainly setbacks significantly. Relations with Europe will be hit very hard. There will be sanctions from some countries, maybe not EU-wide sanctions. Even that is not impossible. Certainly a hit with our relations with Britain, which have improved nicely in recent years. And then, well, Israel's primary focus is always on the United States. As I said, the Trump administration is having some second thoughts of its own. Mr. Biden has come out strongly against it. Israel has allowed itself the totally misguided luxury of a precipitous decline in support on the Democratic side in recent years. There is a lot of pent-up fury on the Democratic side waiting to come out if Mr. Biden is elected. I believe that he will moderate those trends if elected, but will not be able to completely. And frankly, what I think Israel is doing is simply shooting itself in the foot at the moment.
In terms of regional implications, I mean, first of all, there's the Gulf perspective, which would be great to get from Dr. Aziz, but just kind of almost slightly beneath that, one thing that I've heard bandied around myself in recent days is George Floyd-style protests in Jordan and in Lebanon, especially in Palestinian refugee camps, and also particularly in Jordan, perhaps even a threat to the peace accord, or even to regime, the government rather, stability. I mean, do we have any, would anyone like to jump in there?
Well, I think there are a few points I'd like to emphasize. Number one, yes, we can see some country trying to outreach or to accept communication with Israel. But communication is different than normalization of relations. What we would like to see is the Israeli and the Palestinian coming into an agreement. And you remember 2002, the Arab Initiative for Peace, that was during the time of King Abdullah, then it became an Arab Initiative. We always remember what President Nixon said, that Israel cannot live in a lake of hatred amongst their neighborhood. So they need to reach an agreement and a settlement, where they can have peace and everybody can live together on that one. We're trying to break the traditional story that it's hatred to Israel, and so by saying no, there is no hatred to Israel. The Israeli have the right to exist, but we need them to come into an agreement. The two-state solution is there. Maybe they should reconsider that and try to doing the annexation at this time does not help. But I agree with the analysis with regard to the timing, everybody's been busy with something, the COVID, the world is busy, but at the same time, the Palestinians will not give it up. And if the Palestinians will not give it up, it means they're willing to continue to have their own intifada, willing to do whatever it takes, to try to protect. We have pushed a lot the Palestinian Authority, and remember, we remain supportive of the Palestinian Authority. Saudi Arabia contributed something like $7.4 billion to the Palestinian Authority. We still pay $7 million a month, to keep the Palestinian Authority. We still pay our share to the UNRWA to keep, because we have not seen a member of ISIS from the Palestinian side. But if we don't try to support them and give them the right to exist and to live on that tent or whatever they're there, then we may see, ISIS try to attract them and take them, and then they tend to be a terrorist instead of being a refugee. So there isn't a sort of I would call two level we moved. We moved in one level, that Judaism and Islamism, and this is where you see Sheikh Al-Isa, the head of the Islamic League, with his visit to Poland, to Germany, to everywhere, talking to the rabbi and the right of coexistence. It's a great thing to see, and that has to do with the religious. When it comes to the Israel as a state, yes, we have recognized the right of the Israeli existence also there, but at the same time, we wish to see we have rejected the deal of the century and all the outcome of that. We thought that Trump went too far in terms of moving the embassy. There's nobody dealing with that embassy in Jerusalem. Things should have been done in agreement and consensus with the other side.
Can I jump to I think it's nuts, quite honestly. It's for temporary political advantage. Think of what you put at risk. I defer to Dr. Freilich on all of this, but there wasn't. The West Bank was quiet. The Palestinian security forces, rather contrary to my expectations, actually, were working very closely with the Israeli security forces to detect threats at considerable cost to themselves. And now all this is put at risk. And not just this, but of course relations with Jordan. You mentioned Jordan. The king has been absolutely clear in what he thinks about this. And this is a problem for him. And they've already the whole incident in the spring where they refused to renew the long-term lease on that patch of land down in Al-Arabiya was actually quite an interesting sort of straw in the wind. But also consider the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinians aren't going anywhere. You annex, or if you're on a trajectory towards annexing the West Bank, what status do they have? Now Abu Mazen, I actually think the Palestinian Authority has become fat, corrupt, all the sort of things that everybody else says about it. But what the Palestinian Authority has done over the last 20 years has acted as a gigantic automatic telling machine, an ATM for the Palestinian population, because the economy has been squeezed and suffocated. And this will be even more so with any sort of annexation. The Palestinians rely on the kindness of donors. It's donors that have kept the Palestinian Authority alive. You go through annexation, and there's already, I think, donor fatigue out there. You see it with UNRWA. The risk of a further economic collapse, certainly a massive decline in living standards for Palestinians in the West Bank with this going on, I think is quite serious. You get that, I think, all bets are off.
If I could just add two quick points to that. Okay, I think my position on annexation was probably reasonably clear. But let's also put this in perspective, and the perspective is that there were frankly no prospects for peace in any event. And almost regardless of who is in office at any given time in Israel today, the Palestinians have rejected every possible deal. A deal 20 years ago that would have given them a Palestinian state, a capital in Jerusalem, or half of Jerusalem, 97% of the territory plus a 2% land swap. It wasn't enough. There is still a very basic historic question, which is whether the Palestinians, and of course when I say Palestinians, that's a generalization, whether the Palestinians have crossed the Rubicon and made the historic decision of a willingness to live in peace next to a predominantly Jewish Israel. And that is still a major question mark. And even if Abu Mazen, President Abbas, is willing to reach a deal, his successor, they can't, because they don't speak for the entire Palestinian entity. There are two Palestinian entities today, and Hamas has no intention whatsoever of reaching a deal. Add to that the horrors of the Second Intifada, over almost 1,100 Israelis killed, murdered, and the rejectionism and the terrorism undermined, really destroyed the Israeli peace camp. And the reason that you have had the last couple of decades of, not entirely, but mostly right-wing rule, has been because no one in Israel, including the left, believes that there are any prospects for peace. So what difference does it make? Well, of course, it makes a difference. And I certainly don't think Israel should be taking measures that make it harder to reach a two-state solution. But I think what we really need is a move on the part of the Palestinians with strong support by the Arab countries, and I don't think we've seen sufficient, to finally truly embrace a two-state solution, not just in word, but in deed.
We're just very conscious of time. We only have about 20 minutes left. So I think we'll go now to Q&A from the audience. So to ask a question, if you could just click raise hand, and then I'll call on you. I see one hand from Dr. John Svakanakis, also at the GRC. Hello, Dr. John. Like to jump in?
Hello, Jay. Nice to see you. Thank you for organizing this. I want to go back and bring back something. I want to go back to what Sir John said, and also bring back an important theme that is often not forgotten, but because of the complexity of politics, the economy is forgotten. And I think in this occasion, it's not only what Sir John said of what is the definition of the Arab state, but also what is the definition of the Arab economy. And the Arab economy today is very much connected and intertwined with oil. If you're in Egypt or in the oil, let's say, importing countries, your dependency on oil, even if not direct, is there because your population is working in the Gulf countries. And Gulf countries are now forcibly and unavoidably, because oil prices are going down or staying down for quite some time, is forcing the labor force from the Arab oil importers to exit the rich Gulf states and return back. That is creating a problem. And if the rich oil exporters, rich within brackets, do not foresee the oil revenues to coming in, they will have a problem. And not only you will have a political problem, which seems to be the complexity of the Middle East, but also the failure of Arab states to produce wealth, income, prosperity. Cronyism pervades in most countries. However, crony capitalism has pervaded in most Arab states, and what also John alluded to, which is from time to time we have tendencies of kleptocracy to discover themselves, to appear. So I would say that there hasn't been a successful model. There is this Arab fascination with the Arab city. You go anywhere in the Middle East and every leader is creating a city for himself. Today, this leader wants a city somewhere. The other day, the leader wants something else. New Cairo, old Cairo, new this, new that. And everything seems to be failing, notwithstanding COVID, but it has not really sustainably created jobs, has created jobs for expats. I want to also, so this is a thought for the esteemed panel, but also I want to go back to what Dr. Freilich said, which is important, about Mohammed bin Salman. And this is also a comment to his question. You know, he's doing too many things. Why he's doing, maybe there is failure to doing too many things. And I think the response is that, yes, he's doing a lot of things, but also he doesn't have time. And time is against him. And what the proof to that is clearly that oil has been pulled off the carpet, and that has created a new dynamic for all of the oil producing states, including Saudi Arabia. He doesn't have time. And if you think that the oil states have another maybe 5 to 10 years to go, because we're peaking oil, and oil is not going to go back to 100. It might go to 60, it might go to 80, but that's it. And all their budgets, whether you are in Iran or you're in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, is above what we see today. The cost of extraction in Oman is $27. In Saudi Arabia, it's $4, but oil is at 40, and half of Saudi Arabia's budget today goes towards salaries, he doesn't have time. And I think the complex issue to think of is that on top of the politics, which seems to be, and I completely agree, a disaster, now they have a disaster economy. And it's coming to haunt them very quickly. And nobody's going to bail them out. The Americans are going back to America. The Chinese are sitting in China doing roads, whether it's silk or velvet or cotton, I'm not sure what it is exactly. The Europeans, they're trying to discover if it's a union or if it's a European Union. So the Middle East is really left to its own. And I would add to Dr. Freilich's concern about Israel is that also a lot of the Arab countries—
Dr. John, sorry to interrupt, but we're just running very low on time.
Yeah,
so,
could end up going to Israel. Instead of just going to Europe, they might end up also encroaching into Israeli territory. And there are, 200 million of them, instead of going all the way to Europe. Thank you, Jay. Sorry for taking more time.
No. So what was there a question for the panel? Was that more of a thought?
The question is the economy, and certainly I think that's the underlying issue.
Just very quickly brief on that one. I think the Saudi government today are focusing on the youth. They want to recruit them, empower them, entertain them. So that's a big issue because again, 70% of the population under the age of 30. There's a great focus on the young generation in terms of employing and empowering, and also giving the chance for a quality of life to do. I'm sure the Vision 2030 has a lot of good things about it, but at the same time, there's a serious challenges, which include FDI, foreign direct investment to the country, which include building capacity, which include issues like legislative, neighborhood competitiveness. All these issues are still, challenges for the Vision 2030.
Can I just add one thing, Jay? I mean, across the region, youth unemployment is extremely high. Unemployment is extremely high. I mean, I think the Middle East has the highest level of youth unemployment globally, and an equally significant component of this is the unemployment of women. And I think it's clearly been recognised in Saudi Arabia that you need to get women into the jobs market, but you need jobs. You need proper jobs for them to go to. I think the Gulf can manage. I think Syria, no. I think Iraq, big problem. I think Egypt is a slow motion car crash, quite honestly. And I think other bits of Libya, of course, is disaster, but Algeria as well. And this is a major problem for Europe. If Europe wants a policy, it has to put this actually at the heart of it.
Anyone else who might have a question, if you just raise your hand, and I will ask you if you just message me in the participants panel. I think just in the meantime, I think one thing that was a recurring theme was the question of American involvement in the region, and especially the consequence of the election, if it's a Trump or a Biden presidency. I mean, I think it would be interesting just to quickly give our thoughts on either scenario. So if we have 4 more years of President Trump, which seems to be the more unlikely scenario, do we have any thoughts on what that might look like?
We did look at the security agenda for us in the region here, and honestly, the 3 of them has to do with the US, whether counterterrorism, continuous cooperation in terms of counterterrorism, and how counterterrorism will change after the corona. Are they going to change to biological warfare, and instead of AK-47, they can still create it at the lab and use it, and they saw how effective is that, and so. And the second, of course, Iran, and how is the US is going to continue dealing with Iran and the role of Iran in terms of the security of the region. The supply of the weapon system to the region, because we are very much committed to Western military doctrine, and a lot of our weapon system comes from the US. In case of a cheap oil prices, is that going to give us the ability to continue to procure and buy the weapon system from there? And the fourth, of course, is how the US-China conflict is going to be, and how the US is going to impose it in their alliances in the region. I mean, we consider ourselves in the Gulf closer, stronger in terms of alliances to the US, but at the same time, 65%, I mean, 32% of China imported energy comes from the Gulf country. If we're going to receive a pressure from the US, don't sell to China, you are with us or against us, we don't want you, that will have a major impact in our economy, in our export. So it depends how the relation will develop between China and the US, also will have a major impact so Iran, the procurement of the weapon system, the counterterrorism issue, and the relation to China, that will be very important issues for us.
Can I add something very, very quickly? I mean, you don't need to have American troops in the region for the Americans to be involved in the region.
No.
You know, and people talk about the withdrawal of US troops as if this is a disaster. Well, it depends. I mean, you know, there was a point about withdrawing troops if they're exposed. And actually, if you look at Iraq, they've been exposed, they've withdrawn to more fortified bases. But, you know, you can see an argument for saying, we're out of here because we're just hostages to fortune. But to do that, you need a plan for the other stuff, for cyber, for intelligence cooperation. I mean, the most significant thing the United States did with the Iraqi security forces, particularly the counterterrorism forces, before 2014 and after the rise of Daesh, was intelligence sharing, real-time operational intelligence sharing and training. And the same applies to the Kurds. I mean, the trouble is with US policy, we don't know what it is. We don't know what the plan is. You can take the troops home, fine. But what's the plan for when you've taken the troops home? And that's the gap. That's the space which needs filling.
Let me also add a couple of points on this. The question came up before, how much does the Middle East matter today to the West generally and to the US specifically? And I remember participating in a number of discussions with American colleagues, and they're making the argument, which I buy, that there probably aren't vital American interests at stake today in the Middle East. The question is how, of course, you define the word vital. There's no existential threat to the United States, and it's not direct superpower rivalry in its importance. But at the same time, if you just come down a notch, I think the Mideast remains extremely important. Now, maybe the US is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but the world economy is, and the oil market is one international market in the end. So the US still cares a great deal, or should, about the regional oil market. And 9/11, if you look at what was the historic strategic consequence of 9/11 for the United States, going beyond, of course, the human tragedy, it was the Middle East exporting its problems directly to American soil and the Middle East becoming a direct threat to American national security. I don't think that potential has changed, okay? The Middle East's fundamental problems are still very much there, and they may reach American soil or certainly American interests again. And the example before of how the regional migration issue almost brought the EU, almost caused a splinter in the EU and contributed to the Brexit decision in the UK.
Thank you. So we have a question from...
I had a couple more points there still. Look, Mr. Putin has been very effective in playing a weak hand in the region. Partly, I have to give him credit, some deft diplomacy, but it's partly simply taking advantage of the void that the United States has not played as much in recent years. It's vacated the playing field. I think that's dangerous. I think the US has played an important moderating role in regional politics for the last few decades. I think it is critical. I think the UK has what to contribute to it. I think if we have another 4 years of Mr. Trump-style leadership, there's a question how NATO will weather this. There's certainly a question of how Middle Eastern allies will weather it, and I'm quite concerned about that. I think it's hard to say what Mr. Biden's policies might be, but at least I think it would be back to more centrist, moderate policies, more in accordance with what we're familiar with from the past.
Can I just add one very quick thing, Joe, which is China? I mean, you talked about China, and I think China is really important. You know, if the big challenge for the United States is China, which it is, then the Middle East is also a site for strategic competition with China. Now, the United States might not think that, but the Chinese certainly think it. If you look at the Belt and Road, they're in Hamad Port in Doha. They're interested in Duqm in Oman, Gwadar in Pakistan, Djibouti, up the Red Sea on the Egyptian side. They're interested in Haifa, in a high-speed link between Eilat and Haifa. I mean, they're interested in Syria. They're interested in Iran. And I think if all this stuff is part of a global strategic competition, that if you are the global hyperpower, you're supposed to help do something about, especially if you think that China is your main focus.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to Laura now. Hi, Laura.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a really interesting discussion, but one point that struck me was how very little we have talked about Syria, which is interesting because 5 or 6 years ago, that would have been the main focus of a topic like this. We would have spent a lot of time on it. And I'm wondering if people, the panel particularly, think that with the economic situation deteriorating and with the potential loss of the Lebanon outlet, this is again likely to become central to the region, or if actually the Russian presence and the relative stalemate and the loss of credibility of Islamic State, of course, primarily, will keep it contained.
I'll make one comment, which is that paradoxically, I would not have said this in the past. Russia is probably the primary hope for anything good happening in Syria, and Russia is playing something of a stabilizing role in the absence of the US there. Otherwise, no one else is going to bring stability. You're going to be willing to make the commitment, and the Russian commitment is also limited.
This is this is going to be a long running, and I agree with the question. I mean, it has sort of gone off the rails because people are just there's a sort of wariness with what's happened in Syria, and Western policy, quite honestly, was all over the place from the beginning on Syria. And the Russians, Putin has done very well. But the problem is going to be going forward. How do you reconstruct Syria? How do you reconstruct it as a state with control over all those territories, given especially that the Turks have their ambitions in the north, and want to have a zone of consolidated influence along almost the entire border. And then what do you do about physical reconstruction? Now, people are talking about it, they're saying, well, it's going to happen. Who's going to fund it? I mean, it's like it's like Iraq. The Iraqi parliament has just given Qasmi the power to raise money internationally, to borrow internationally. Who the hell is going to lend to Iraq? And it's the same with Syria. Who is going to fund this reconstruction? I don't get it. But if you don't fund the reconstruction, and because the Syrians can't export oil anymore, because they can't rape the banking system in Lebanon, which they did at the height of the Makhloufs, what happens to the people? I mean, already a third of the population of Syria is in exile. I mean, this itself is a slow motion disaster, political disaster for the neighboring countries, for Jordan, for Lebanon, for Turkey, but also for Europe. And again, there may be discussions happening in foreign ministries and chancellors about this, about what you do now to put Syria back together again. But I don't know what it is. And I can't see how it can happen as long as Assad remains in the position that he does. And that's where the Russians come in, which is what Chuck freilich just said. It is, if anybody's going to do that deal, it's going to have to be done through Putin.
Okay. So just being conscious of time, we have one more question that I received from Will over private message. So Dr. Freilich described the Russia-Syria relationship as being transactional compared to the Iran-Syria relationship, which he described as being there for the long run. Would he be able to expand a little on the Russia-Syria relationship being transactional?
Okay. Look, I said that I think Russia is there for the long term. Also, if only because they signed a 49-year lease for both the Khamimim air base and the naval base.
Tartus.
And Tartus, excuse me, Tartus Naval Base and the Khamimim Air Base.
Yeah, base.
And that's a lot of money. Countries don't do that for the short term. And this is more importantly for Russia, this is part of the strategic rivalry with the United States. And if I can allow myself to reduce Russian national security policy to one sentence, and of course I'm doing the violence, it is to stick it to the United States wherever they can. Syria is one of the few places in the world where they've succeeded in doing that. There are one or two others. And Syria is also a focal point for them to project power in the Mediterranean at a time when the US involvement has decreased generally, diplomatically, when the Sixth Fleet its military presence is much smaller than it was in the past. And I think at a very low cost to Russia, Mr. Putin has succeeded in achieving a great deal. Now, so he wants to be there for the long term. His commitment is limited. He's not willing to lose troops, not in significant numbers. He was quite happy to fight at the expense of Iranian/Hezbollah fighters, not Iranian fighters, a few Revolutionary Guards. Oh, excuse me, that's the Iranians. But he was not willing to commit Russian ground troops here. He's trying now to get some payback on his investment in terms of the reconstruction in Syria. Of course, there are limits because, as Sir Jenkins was saying, the Syrian capability to pay is quite limited. For Iran, I believe this is a longer term, or at least a more fundamental, rather than long term. It's a more fundamental commitment. Iran wishes to be a leader or the leader of the Arab world. It wants to lead the Arab world in the battle against Israel. It needs Syria for that. It needs Syria as Syria. It needs Syria as an access point to Lebanon. Iran has no other friends in the world, maybe Venezuela. It's pretty much Syria and of course Russia, the triangle. They all need each other. They don't have too many other choices. So I think this is a deeper commitment. And of course, there are limits to what they're willing to do also. Everything in the end, all international commitments are transactional, but the Iranian one here is far deeper, I believe.
Can I just one very quick thing, Jay, which is, sorry, Dr. Aziz.
Go ahead, sir.
Very quick. History teaches us lots of things, if people read history. I've just been rereading Herodotus, which of course is the last time the Persians were on the Mediterranean. Putin has done what the Tsars always wanted to do. I mean, we fought a war in the 1850s, the Crimean War, to stop them breaking out into the Mediterranean. But they have broken out into the Mediterranean, and they're in Libya, as are the Turks. You think about the crisscrossing claims to mineral rights in the Mediterranean, and none of this ended well. I mean, not from Xerxes onwards. None of this ended well for Europe, and I think this is a real. All of this combined is a strategic problem for Europe. And Putin has quite honestly has handled this in a transactional way with great skill.
Yeah, you know, sometimes we see Putin movement as a bargaining chip. You know, when he started in Syria, it was a 3 aircraft, as I mentioned at the beginning. But now today, we have the evidence from the African forces that 16 aircraft being landed in Syria, painted there, being used now in Libya. So in reality, Russia intention of expansionism and having their foothold quite strong, it's important. I think Haftar made a big mistake by going too far on the Russian side. I think you need to revisit that, because if the US, as I said before, most of the players in the Libyan platform are very close to the US, and the US still can have the control of stopping many of them. But 2 points here I would like to mention. I like to mention in my previous track 2 discussion, one of the Iranian senior officials, he said, we have been kicked out of the Mediterranean twice in history. Today we are back. All the way I can see the pipeline from Abadan to Tartus. That's what he said exactly in Geneva in one of our track 2 discussion. This is why they are encouraging today the railway system from Basra back to Turku, so we can have a quick and a fast deployment if they wanted to use see that one. So again, Syria is important, but at the same time, there are too many players, as I said in the beginning with that one.
Oh, it seems like we're out of time. Obviously, there are 1,000 other things that we could have discussed. We could have made it a conference, but unfortunately, it's time to end. I mean, I invite all of our speakers to give short closing statements, kind of summing up their thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I'll just make one closing comment, or maybe two. The second one is that the Middle East is always an area of great interest. Nothing has changed. I think what we could all use is a huge portion of boredom, but unfortunately that's probably not going to be the case, so there will be lots more interesting exchanges such as this. The other point I was going to make is that this is not the first time I've had the opportunity to share a panel with a Saudi colleague. First of all, I'm very happy to have that opportunity. It wasn't the case in the past. But secondly, I think it has stood out to me in these occasions, the commonality of our views on many, not all of the issues, but on many of them. And that's a remarkable change in the Middle East. Decades in the making. I very much hope that we can all find ways to go forward. I hope none of us take measures that will set that process back.
Just very briefly, I think the thing that's lacking from the British perspective, from the European perspective, from the American perspective, is a policy. I think we haven't had a proper policy on most of these issues, and there needs to be a joined up policy, but also coordinated and convened properly internationally. We haven't had this since the beginning of the Arab Spring, since 2010, 2011, and even before that maybe. And that's a pretty damning observation, I think. We need to get our act together.
Well, lastly, thank you very much for this kind of invitation. I've enjoyed very much, this talk with our colleagues here. At the same time, one day I wrote an article where people did not like it when I said we have lost a lot by not talking to the Israeli, because at least if we talk to them, we can find out what they think, what they're up to, bring our case, defend our case, try to legitimize what we are up to, and so we stand to gain a better instead of boycotting even the talk with that one. I hope the talk with the Israeli intelligentsia and the intellectual people and the think tank can bring a better understanding. We, as I said, the right of existence, and at the same time, we hope that we all live in peace in the region here. At the same time, the problem in the Middle East remains very crucial, very important for them and for us. And we wanted to see how can we bring peace and stability in the region. Security architecture is very important. Development is very important. Sustainability is very important. Job is very important. All these issues, and I'm sure if we work together toward a better peace in the region, we hopefully can achieve that.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Thank you very, very much to our speakers and to everyone who attended. And I hope to see you all at our next event, which is a TED Talk with Sheikh Nahyan bin Mubarak, the Emirati Minister for Tolerance, which should be on our website in the next couple of weeks. So thank you very, very much, everyone, and have a great week. Thank you.